Most Americans believe that what happens in the Middle East stays in the Middle East. They see the news footage of tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. They hear the president say it does not really affect us. We have so much oil. We have tremendous oil and gas, much more than we need. And they go about their day. They buy their groceries, they fill their tanks, they pay their bills, and they do not connect the images they saw this morning to the numbers they will see on their statements next month. That disconnect between what is happening 7,000 miles away in a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman and what happens in the bank account of a family in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Texas is the most expensive misunderstanding in modern American life. Because every single move Iran makes in the Strait of Hormuz transmits, through channels that most people do not see and have never been explained, directly into the cost of living for every household in the United States. And what I am about to walk you through are the 10 specific ways that one move from Iran affects every American, starting right now and accelerating through the summer. Not theory, not speculation. Already documented. Already measured. Already showing up on your receipts. And the reason I am doing this as a countdown from 10 to 1 is that each level of impact is bigger than the last, and by the time we get to number 1, you will understand why the Congressional Research Service, the Dallas Federal Reserve, the International Energy Agency, and the head of the IEA himself have all called what is happening right now the largest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s. This video is the first part of that countdown. Watch the whole thing, because the piece that starts at number 10 is the piece that every other piece builds on, and the families that understand this countdown will be the families that are prepared for what is arriving, and the families that do not will discover it the way they always discover these things. When the bill comes. So here we go. Number 10. Before a single barrel of oil failed to arrive at an American refinery, before a single gallon of gasoline rose at the pump, before a single grocery price changed at the store, there was a document that shifted the entire architecture of global trade and that almost no American has ever heard of. It is called a war risk insurance policy. Every commercial ship that transits the Strait of Hormuz, every tanker carrying crude oil, every vessel carrying liquefied natural gas, every container ship moving pharmaceuticals and electronics and polyethylene and sulfur is required to carry insurance. And the insurance providers have a clause in every policy called a 72-hour cancellation clause that allows them to withdraw coverage with 72 hours of notice when a conflict emerges in the waters the vessel is transiting. In late February 2026, when the first strikes were exchanged, those cancellation clauses were activated, and what the Congressional Research Service documented is that insurance premiums reportedly surged to 4 or 5 times their previous levels within days. Before the conflict, war risk insurance for a transit of the strait was approximately 0.125% of the insured ship value. Within weeks it rose to between 0.2 and 0.4%. For a very large crude carrier carrying 2 million barrels of oil worth approximately $200 million, that is an additional insurance cost of $250,000 to $800,000 per transit, per trip. And the Kpler market intelligence firm put it in one of the most important sentences written about this crisis. Insurance withdrawal is doing the work that physical blockade has not. The outcome for cargo flow is largely the same. The strait did not need to be physically closed for the oil to stop flowing. The insurance companies did the closure for Iran, because without insurance, no shipping company will risk a $200 million tanker, and no lender will finance a voyage that is not insured, and no cargo owner will authorize a shipment that is uninsured. The entire global trading system runs on insurance, and when the insurance withdraws, the trade stops, even if every ship in the world is technically free to sail. And the cost of that insurance, the $250,000 to $800,000 per transit premium, does not get absorbed by the shipping companies. It flows directly into the price of every barrel of oil, every pound of fertilizer, every container of polyethylene, every shipment of pharmaceuticals and electronics that arrives at an American port. That is the first and most invisible tax that Iran's move imposed on every American: insurance rates. You do not see it on your gas receipt. You do not see it on your grocery bill. But it is embedded in every price you pay, and it moved before anything else did. That is how you can tell the crisis was already real before any headline announced it. The insurance companies knew, and the insurance companies repriced the world overnight, and you are paying for that repricing in every transaction you have conducted since the first week of March. Number 9. There is a chemical compound that 99% of Americans have never thought about that more than any other single substance determines whether there is food on the grocery shelves this fall. That compound is urea. Urea is the most common nitrogen fertilizer in the world. It is what farmers apply to corn, wheat, and soybean fields in March and April so that the crops can grow through the summer and produce a harvest in September and October. And approximately 50% of globally traded urea transits through the Strait of Hormuz because Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, and Oman are among the largest urea producers on Earth. And when the strait closed in late February, Qatar Fertiliser Company, which operates the largest urea production facility in the world, went offline. Urea prices, which had been trading around $350 per ton, surged to $650 per ton within weeks. That is an 86% increase. And the Fertilizer Institute estimated that U.S. farmers faced a shortfall of approximately 2 million tons of urea this spring. And because fertilizer is a time-sensitive input, you cannot apply it retroactively. American farmers had two options. They could plant less of the crops that require heavy nitrogen fertilization, which is mostly corn, or they could pay the new prices and accept lower profit margins. Most chose the first option. Corn acreage in the United States dropped 3.5% compared to last year. Farmers pivoted to soybeans, which require less nitrogen. And that single decision, made by thousands of farmers in the Corn Belt in March and April, has already determined the size of the 2026 corn harvest. And the corn harvest determines the price of feed for every cattle, poultry, hog, and dairy operation in America. And the feed price determines the price of every cut of beef, every pound of chicken, every gallon of milk, every carton of eggs, and every package of bacon at your grocery store this fall. The Helios AI intelligence platform publicly projected that global food prices are heading 12 to 18% higher by year-end because of this fertilizer disruption. And the FAO warned that if the Strait disruption exceeds 3 months, which it already has, structural damage to global food supply chains locks in higher prices for at least a year. But here is the part that nobody on mainstream financial television is telling you. The fertilizer disruption also hit sulfur exports from the Gulf, because Gulf countries account for approximately 45% of global sulfur supply, and sulfur is required for sulfuric acid, which is required for copper processing. Chile, which supplies 1/5 of the world's copper, depends on imported sulfuric acid for 20% of its copper mining operations. China, when its own sulfuric acid exports were strangled, halted exports entirely to secure domestic supply. Which means copper is about to get more expensive. Which means every wire, every pipe, every electric vehicle battery, every electrical component in every appliance and every home is about to cost more. Iran did not have to close the strait directly. The insurance companies and the producers did the closure. And a single missing shipment of urea from Qatar reshaped the global economy, the copper industry, and the price of every cut of meat in your grocery store this fall. That is the chain you never saw because nobody explained it to you. Number 8. Gasoline gets the headlines because gasoline gets the cameras. News crews go to filling stations and film the prices on the big signs. They interview drivers, they run the charts. But gasoline is not the fuel that determines the cost of living in America. Diesel is, and diesel has done something since late February that almost no major news outlet has reported on with the urgency it deserves. Diesel surged from approximately $3.89 per gallon to $5.38 per gallon, a 41% increase in weeks. And here is why that matters more than the gasoline price. Every truck that delivers food to every grocery store in America runs on diesel. Every train that moves grain from the Midwest to the coasts runs on diesel. Every ship that carries containers into American ports burns diesel or marine fuel made from the same refinery cuts. Every piece of farm equipment, tractors, combines, planters, sprayers, runs on diesel. Every generator that powers a data center or a hospital or a cell tower during a blackout runs on diesel. Every construction excavator, every concrete truck, every mining loader, every piece of logistics infrastructure in the American economy runs on diesel. And an analyst at supply chain intelligence firm E2 Open told Food Navigator USA that diesel makes up approximately 30% of transportation costs for the food industry, and the 41% diesel increase translates to approximately a 10 to 15% increase in food transport costs. And that 10 to 15% applies to every product on every shelf in every grocery store in America. A loaf of bread, a can of beans, a gallon of milk, a pound of apples, a box of cereal, all of them have to move on a diesel-powered truck from a distribution center to the store. And the cost of that movement just went up by 10 to 15%. And the researchers at the Congress-commissioned Dallas Federal Reserve documented that the war more than doubled the price of kerosene-based products like diesel and jet fuel, because refineries in the Gulf region and in parts of Asia were built to process heavier crude oils that come from the Persian Gulf, and they lacked the technical capacity to substitute the lighter crude produced in American shale basins. That mismatch between the crude the world produces and the crude the refineries are built to process is why American oil production does not automatically solve this problem. We produce the wrong kind of oil for the refineries that make diesel and jet fuel at scale. And the result is that while the president says America has tremendous oil and it does not really affect us, American diesel prices went up 41% anyway because the global diesel market cannot be solved by American shale production alone. And every family in America, whether they drive a diesel truck or not, pays for that increase through the price of every product they buy. Diesel is the invisible tax that nobody talks about, because it does not have a nice round number on a gas station sign. But it is the single most important price in the American economy. And Iran's move just raised it by 41%. Number 7. Jet fuel is diesel's twin. They are both kerosene-based distillates that come from the same fraction of the crude oil barrel during refining. And when diesel prices surge, jet fuel surges with it. And the disruption to jet fuel since the Strait closure has been more severe than the disruption to gasoline, because Kuwait is a foreign central hub in regional jet fuel supply, and because the closure of airspace across the Middle East forced airlines to reroute flights on longer paths that circumnavigate the region, burning more fuel per flight and putting more pressure on already constrained jet fuel stocks. The Kpler intelligence firm documented that the jet crack, which is the price spread between crude oil and jet fuel that measures refinery profitability on that product, has remained elevated for weeks and is likely to be more persistent than the gasoline shock, because global jet fuel supply is less distributed and the arbitrage network is less flexible. And what that translates to for every American who flies is an airfare increase that is not being reported as a war cost because the airlines do not label it that way. They label it as fuel surcharges. They label it as peak season pricing. They label it as dynamic pricing. But the underlying driver is the cost of jet fuel. And the cost of jet fuel went up because Iran's move forced a global repricing of every kerosene-based product. And for the American families who were planning summer travel, the vacation they budgeted for in January is now going to cost 15 to 25% more depending on the route, the carrier, and the booking window. And for the American businesses that ship cargo by air because the cargo is time-sensitive or perishable, the freight cost just went up by a margin that every one of those businesses will pass through to the end customer. That is why overnight shipping costs more now. That is why perishables in grocery stores cost more now. That is why pharmaceuticals that move by air cost more now. Every product that moves by air is carrying a higher fuel cost that is embedded in the price you pay at the checkout counter. And the Wichita State University supply chain expert Usha Haley documented that about 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East transit through the Strait of Hormuz, and that shortages and backlogs will raise the price of packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods in the weeks ahead. Polyethylene is in every plastic bottle, every grocery bag, every food container, every medical device package, every toy, every piece of consumer electronics. And when the polyethylene supply chain is disrupted by the same conflict that disrupted the jet fuel market and the diesel market and the fertilizer market, the cost of everything that uses plastic, which is essentially everything in modern American life, goes up. That is the third hidden tax that Iran's move placed on every American. Not at the pump, not at the airport. In the price of the package that holds the food you eat, the medicine you take, and the products you order online. Every one of them got more expensive. And you are paying that increase without knowing why. Number 6. There is a category of product that Americans depend on every day, that they cannot live without, that most of them take for granted, and that has been quietly depending on a shipping lane they have never studied. That product is pharmaceutical drugs. And what almost no American realizes is that the United States has outsourced approximately 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the actual molecules that make drugs work, to manufacturers in India and China. And the shipping lanes that carry those active ingredients from Indian and Chinese factories to American pharmaceutical plants pass through the same waters that are now subject to war risk insurance surcharges, rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, and weeks of delay. The Traffic's logistics firm's vice president of strategic solutions told CNBC that petrochemical inputs, plastics, rubber, electronics, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and sugar are among the sectors facing supply chain stress from the Strait disruption. And the Moody supply chain analyst warned that for many commodities transiting the strait to Asian and European markets, inventories typically cover only a few weeks, meaning shortages could emerge relatively quickly if disruptions persist. And pharmaceuticals are particularly exposed because the industry operates on what is called just-in-time inventory. Hospitals do not stockpile medications. Pharmacies do not maintain large reserves. The system is designed to deliver the right drug to the right patient at the right moment, which means the buffer between a supply disruption and a patient shortage is measured in weeks, not months. And the FDA has already documented that as of April 2026, there are more than 120 active drug shortages in the United States, including shortages of common blood pressure medications, chemotherapy drugs, IV fluids, and basic antibiotics. And the shortages are not being driven by American policy failures alone. They are being driven by global shipping disruptions that most Americans never heard of and that their pharmacist cannot explain because their pharmacist was not told the shipment was delayed until it did not arrive. And here is the compounding factor that makes this a uniquely dangerous crisis. When a pharmaceutical shortage occurs, the drugs that are available get bid up in price and allocated to the highest-paying customers, which in practice means the largest hospital systems and the wealthiest zip codes. The rural hospital that was already struggling to stay open now cannot access the insulin, the heart medication, or the antibiotic that its patients need. The independent pharmacy that serves a small community cannot compete with the purchasing power of CVS or Walgreens, and discovers that the medication it ordered 3 weeks ago will not arrive or will arrive at twice the wholesale price it paid for the previous shipment. And the patient who has been on the same daily medication for 15 years walks in to refill their prescription and is told that it is not available, or that the copay has tripled, or that they will have to wait 2 weeks for the next shipment. And every one of those patient experiences is being driven, directly or indirectly, by a crisis in a waterway 7,000 miles away that the pharmacist cannot see and that the patient cannot understand. That is the pharmaceutical channel of the Iran shock. You do not read about it in the news. You do not hear about it from your doctor. You discover it when the pharmacy tech at the counter says we do not have it, and you do not know what to do next. Number 5. The president stood at a press conference on March 9th and said, with great confidence, that America is the largest oil producer in the world by far, and that when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money. He said it does not really affect us. We have tremendous oil and gas, much more than we need. And millions of Americans who heard that statement concluded that the Iran crisis was therefore contained, that American energy independence would buffer the damage, that the president was describing a nation that had achieved strategic autonomy from the Middle East, and that conclusion was wrong. Because the United States, despite producing more crude oil than any country on Earth, produces the wrong kind of oil for the refineries that process most of its fuel. American shale production yields what is called light sweet crude. It is low in sulfur and low in density. But the refineries on the Gulf Coast, which produce approximately 45% of American refined products and export heavily to the rest of the world, were built decades ago to process heavy sour crude, which is high in sulfur and higher in density. That is the type of oil that comes from Venezuela, Canadian oil sands, and the Persian Gulf. Fact check. Org documented that much of the crude oil produced domestically is lighter, while many refineries in the U.S. were long ago configured to use the heavier crude oils produced in other parts of the world. Which is why the United States, despite being the world's largest producer, still imports approximately 7 to 8 million barrels per day of crude oil, primarily from Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and other heavy crude exporters, and still exports millions of barrels per day of the light crude it produces because its own refineries cannot efficiently use it. And when the Strait of Hormuz closed, the heavy sour crude that Gulf Coast refineries depend on became harder to source, more expensive, and slower to arrive. Refineries responded by reducing throughput. Reduced throughput means less refined product, which means lower gasoline supply, lower diesel supply, lower jet fuel supply, and the prices of those products rose regardless of how much light sweet crude was coming out of North Dakota or Texas shale basins. Because shale crude cannot be substituted into a refinery designed for heavy crude any more than diesel fuel can be poured into a gasoline engine. The infrastructure was not built for the substitution, and the infrastructure cannot be rebuilt in weeks or months or even years. It would take approximately $10 to $30 billion per refinery and 5 to 10 years of construction to reconfigure the Gulf Coast refinery complex to process American shale crude. Which means the oil we are producing and the oil we are consuming do not match. And the mismatch is what every American pays for at the pump, in the price of diesel that moves every product, in the price of jet fuel that moves every passenger, and in the cost of every petroleum-derived chemical that the U.S. still imports. The president said it does not really affect us. The refinery engineers know it does. And the gap between those two statements is what is costing your family money right now. Number 4. Every American who has followed oil politics casually for the last several decades knows there is something called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It is the emergency stockpile of crude oil that the federal government maintains in underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, specifically for moments like the one we are living through right now. It was established after the 1973 Arab oil embargo to ensure that the United States would never again be held hostage by a foreign oil shock. And at its peak in 2009, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve held approximately 726 million barrels of crude oil. That reserve was designed to cover approximately 90 days of U.S. net petroleum imports in an emergency. It was the ultimate insurance policy against exactly the kind of Middle East crisis that Iran has just triggered. But most Americans do not know what happened to that reserve. In 2022, during the early months of the Russia-Ukraine war, the federal government released approximately 180 million barrels from the SPR in an effort to stabilize oil prices. That was the largest sustained release in the reserve's history, and the reserve has never been fully refilled. As of early 2026, the SPR holds approximately 395 million barrels, roughly 45% below its 2009 peak and the lowest level since 1984. Which means that at the exact moment when America needed its strategic oil reserve the most, in the middle of the largest supply disruption the International Energy Agency has ever characterized, the reserve is operating at less than half of its design capacity. And the International Energy Agency itself took the unprecedented step of releasing 400 million barrels from global emergency reserves during the Iran crisis, the largest coordinated release in its history. That release has helped soften the worst of the price spike, but it has also drained global emergency inventories, which means the world now has less insurance against the next shock. And the next shock could come from a secondary escalation in the Middle East, from a supply disruption in Russia, from a refinery accident in Asia, from a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast, from any number of possible events that would normally be absorbed by the reserves that are now depleted. And the American family that benefits from artificially subdued gasoline prices this summer because of SPR releases needs to understand what that subsidy is costing. It is costing the nation's strategic insurance policy. The oil is being used to calm the market now. It will not be available to calm the next one. And the refilling of the reserve, if it happens at all, will take years and will occur at prices far higher than the prices at which it was drained. Which means every barrel released now costs the American taxpayer more to replace than it was sold for. That is the invisible cost of the Iran crisis that nobody discusses because it does not show up on a gas station sign. The reserve that was supposed to protect you is being emptied to protect the politicians from the political cost of higher prices. And when it is empty, the next crisis will not have a buffer. And the next crisis is always coming. Number 3. There is a channel through which the Iran crisis reaches every American who has a mortgage, a car loan, a credit card, a student loan, or any form of debt, and that channel operates through a part of the financial system that almost no household thinks about. It is called the bond market. And what happened in the bond market during the Iran crisis is one of the most significant and least covered stories of 2026. On March 27th, the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond jumped to 4.46%, its highest level since July 2025. On the following day, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate climbed to 6.38%. And the reason those two numbers matter more than almost anything else in this video is that the 10-year Treasury yield is the benchmark from which every long-term borrowing rate in the American economy is priced. When the 10-year rises, mortgage rates rise, auto loan rates rise, corporate borrowing costs rise, municipal bond rates that fund schools, roads, and hospitals rise. And the reason the 10-year rose during the Iran crisis is that investors around the world began pricing in higher inflation expectations, which meant they demanded higher yields to compensate for the erosion of their purchasing power over the life of the bond. The St. Louis Federal Reserve had already warned that consumer inflation expectations were becoming unmoored. The Iran shock confirmed the warning. And when long-term expectations shift upward, the entire yield curve shifts with them, and every borrower in America pays the new price. A family shopping for a $400,000 home at 6.38% instead of 6% pays approximately $96 more per month on their mortgage. Over a 30-year loan, that is an additional $34,000 in interest payments. And the family that was already stretching to afford the payment at 6% discovers that the Iran crisis has just priced them out of the home they were about to buy. And the small business that needed a working capital loan to cover the summer inventory discovers that the loan now costs 150 basis points more than it would have cost in February, which either reduces their margins, forces them to raise prices on customers, or forces them to cancel the expansion entirely. And the municipal government that was planning to issue bonds for a school renovation discovers that the bonds will cost taxpayers more over the life of the debt, which means either higher property taxes, reduced project scope, or indefinite postponement. Every one of those outcomes is a consequence of the Iran crisis that is invisible on your gas receipt but permanent on your mortgage statement. And the interest rate increase does not reverse when the strait reopens. Because even if oil prices come back down, the higher inflation expectations that cause the yields to rise have been embedded into investor behavior, and investors do not unembed quickly. They need to see sustained evidence over months and quarters that the inflation spike was transitory. And in the meantime, every American who borrows money is paying the Iran tax every month in the form of interest expense that is higher than it would have been if the conflict had never occurred. That tax does not appear on any headline, but it is on every amortization schedule, every credit card statement, and every loan agreement signed between late February and the indefinite future. The Iran crisis moved the entire cost of borrowing upward, and you are paying for it every time you make a payment. Number 2. The second-to-last channel through which Iran's move reaches every American is the one that most people do not notice until they need the money, and by then the damage is done. It is called your retirement account. Whether it is a 401k, an IRA, a pension, or a brokerage account, the money you have been saving for retirement is invested in a mix of stocks and bonds, and both of those categories have taken damage from the Iran crisis in ways that are systemic, not temporary. When Iran's closure of the strait triggered what the International Energy Agency called the greatest global energy security challenge in history, stock markets experienced declines globally, and there was a global bonds market sell-off. The technology stocks that have driven the majority of retirement account growth over the past decade are particularly vulnerable because their valuations are based on discounted future cash flows, and when interest rates rise, the discount rate applied to those future cash flows rises with them, which reduces the present value of every dollar of expected future earnings. That is why a small change in interest rates can produce a large change in technology stock prices. And the energy crisis pushed rates up, which pushed technology valuations down, which pushed retirement accounts down, and most retirees and near retirees discover the damage only when they look at their quarterly statement and see that the balance they expected has been reduced by an amount they did not authorize and cannot recover without years of market recovery. And the specific damage is worse for Americans who were close to retirement than for those with decades ahead of them. Because the retiree who is 62 or 65 and planning to start drawing down their account does not have time to wait out a market recovery. They have to sell shares at depressed prices to fund their living expenses, locking in the loss permanently. And the same Financial Times investigation that documented insider trading patterns around the Iran conflict, including a $580 million bet on falling oil prices placed 15 minutes before a presidential announcement, reveals a darker truth about who benefits from these shocks. The people with advance information profit. The people without it pay. And the American retiree whose 401k dropped 8 or 12 or 18% during the volatility did not have advance information. They had their statement, and the statement told them that years of compounding had been partially erased in weeks, and the Social Security Trust Fund itself, which is invested in Treasury securities, is affected by these same market dynamics in ways that accelerate its depletion timeline. When yields rise because of geopolitical shocks, the trust fund's paper value on existing holdings falls, and the benefits that were projected to be paid through 2032 or 2033 are now projected to face earlier pressure because the assumptions that underlay the projections have been violated by events. The retirement system that 50 million Americans depend on was not built to withstand the simultaneous impact of demographic decline, legislative cuts, and geopolitical energy shocks. And yet here it is, facing all three at once. And the people depending on it are the last to know how fragile it has become. Number 1. And here is the truth that took 9 previous sections to set up, and that I need you to sit with for a moment before you do anything else today. The single greatest impact of one move from Iran on every American is not economic. It is not financial. It is not even strategic. It is the exposure of how fundamentally unprepared the average American household is for a geopolitical shock that the Congressional Research Service, the Dallas Federal Reserve, and the International Energy Agency have all characterized as the largest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s. Because all of the previous impacts, the insurance surcharges, the fertilizer collapse, the diesel surge, the jet fuel repricing, the pharmaceutical shortages, the refinery mismatch, the depleted strategic reserve, the rising interest rates, and the retirement account damage. All of them were absorbed by an American population that entered this crisis carrying $1.21 trillion in credit card debt at 22.76% interest, that had only 47% of households capable of covering a $1,000 emergency, that was already seeing 7 in 10 adults struggling to pay for food, housing, and health care, and that had watched 2.9 million seniors forced off Medicare Advantage plans and 20 million marketplace enrollees see their premiums double in a single January. The American household that Iran's move landed on in March 2026 was not a resilient household. It was a household that had been hollowed out by 18 months of compounding cost pressures, legislative cuts to safety net programs, healthcare coverage erosion, and the steady transfer of wealth from the middle class to the top of the asset-owning class. And into that hollowed-out household, Iran delivered a shock that added 41% to diesel, 30% to gasoline, 86% to urea fertilizer, 4 to 5 times to shipping insurance, 150 basis points to long-term borrowing, and an unknown but substantial amount to grocery prices that will not fully arrive until the fall harvest is priced. And the president told Americans it does not really affect us. And the media covered the story as a foreign policy event happening in a faraway place. And the average American who does not read the Dallas Federal Reserve, does not follow the Kpler intelligence briefings, does not know what urea is, does not understand why the 10-year Treasury yield matters, discovered none of it. They just noticed that gas was expensive again, and groceries cost more, and the mortgage rate went up, and their 401k dropped, and they could not connect any of it to a waterway between Iran and Oman because nobody connected it for them. That is the true impact of one move from Iran on every American. It revealed that the infrastructure of understanding in this country, the information flow that should connect what happens in the world to what happens in the kitchen, has been broken. And in the gap between what happens and what gets explained, the American household absorbs the full cost of events it does not understand and cannot prepare for. So now you know, and now you can prepare. Stock your pantry before fall harvest prices land. Move savings into high-yield accounts while rates remain elevated. Pay down credit card debt before interest costs consume more of your income. Refill any prescriptions that might face shortages. Have honest conversations with your family about what is coming and how you will respond together. And share this video with every American you know, because knowing is not the whole fight, but it is the first move. And Iran made the first move. It is time for you to make yours. Take care of yourselves out there, see clearly, act accordingly.